The lilies were the first thing she noticed, white and lacquered in a vase that belonged to a life her hands had once smoothed. They smelled like every promise Marcus had broken, clean, perfumed, impossible to keep. Elena stood in the doorway of a bedroom she had helped furnish, breath held long enough for the city wind to slide past the windows and rattle a single blind. Her fingers traced the silk ribbon at the stems without meaning to, because her hands remembered where to find comfort even when her mind had none. The second thing she noticed was the phone on the nightstand, unlocked, the screen full of messages that were not for her. Marcus had always been careless with his secrecy, careless in a way that made him feel untouchable. He was careless and entitled and terrible at imagining consequence. The photographs were small and clear. A woman in a black dress that fit like a second skin, a table at some rooftop restaurant, two bodies laughing. One photo cut at an angle to show Marcus's wedding band on a glass stem. The caption on the last message was a single emoji and nothing more. He had been away the past 2 weeks on business. Elena had believed him and believed otherwise, because believing was a firewall against a slow-burning grief. She let the phone fall back onto the nightstand. The lilies made her stomach twist, bitter, as if someone had squeezed perfume into her blood. Marcus would be home in an hour. He would be practiced and precise in his apologies, if he gave them at all. He would find some way to turn what she had seen into a conversation about her insufficiencies. She had been an artist in a house that saw her as an accessory, a woman whose canvases occasionally matched the throw pillows. For a decade, she had made color out of the margins. She could have waited for the rehearsed cruelty, for the clinic of his voice. Instead, she opened the closet and pulled down one small canvas, unsigned, and shoved it into her satchel. She took nothing else, leaving hurt more if it was well equipped. The elevator smelled like lemon disinfectant and money. By the time the doorman nodded once at her, the half-merciful look of someone who had stored other people's secrets, she was already 2 blocks away, the lilies shrinking in a neat oblong of memory behind her. Her new apartment was a narrow room above a print shop on a street that remembered every kind of footstep. Heat rattled through the radiators, the window fogged when she breathed near it. She set the small canvas on the floor and sat cross-legged until the rawness in her face thinned to a plan. Her phone notified her of an email from Marcus's lawyer, a polite, sharp paragraph about agreed terms, custodial management of accounts, and the impossibility of impulsive transfers. The subject line read, "Protective measures and preservation of joint assets." It was a legal cage disguised as concern. The robber barked and landed his aim on a woman near the door. The woman sobbed. The taller robber demanded the register. The jukebox cracked into static. The man in the charcoal suit moved with the quiet economy of someone who had never been taught the unnecessary parts of motion. He stood up as if deciding the weather, walked across 3 steps, and did something that made Elena's chest pinch. He put his hand on the taller robber's wrist and turned it until the gun pointed to the ceiling. No theatrics, only the bone-slow denial of the thing that wanted to be dangerous. The robber's knees buckled. A second hand, moving from the other man's jacket, slammed the smaller robber into the pool table, and all the air left him. There were no screams, only the kind of sudden, ugly collapse that made the jukebox's song end on a minor chord. When the taller robber tried to lunge, the man in the charcoal suit moved with a grip like a vice and a wrist twist that left the robber breathing too loud and rubbing a sore thumb where the gun had been twisted. He did not say anything to Stan. He did not even look at Elena. He left his hand on the man's wrist as if cataloging its temperature, then released it and slid into the seat at the bar. After the police left, 2 squad cars, questions that felt like mirrors, people drank more than usual. Elena's hands were shaking, not from the adrenaline, but from the hollow recognition that someone had stepped into her small life and made it safer, in a way that felt both like balm and like an injury. the wrong kind of medicine for the right kind of wound. He reached for his glass when no one was watching, and she caught the motion. He smelled of vodka, paper smoke, and something that could be mistaken for old money. He left a folded bill for Stan and a folded card that said, simply, "If you ever need out of something, come find me. N." The initials felt like a cipher. Elena folded the card into the zipper of her jacket the way a child tucks treasure into a shoebox. Nikolai Vulov watched the city from the high dark glass of his office and thought about wolves in the way people with hands like his thought about territory, as lines to mark, as calculations to be made. He had been up since midnight, watching people do things they thought would be small enough to slip past him. Ownership in his vocabulary was not possession alone, but the right to be answered when you called. He kept lists in his head like people kept jewelry. He kept people who were clever and those who were useful. Elena, he had only seen a woman drawing in charcoal on a napkin, was, in the ledger of his attention, an unspent token. He had not planned to touch a bar robbery that night. He did not move unless the friction in his world suggested it would be profitable or necessary. Ownership in his vocabulary was not possession alone, but the right to be answered when you called. He kept lists in his head like people kept jewelry. He kept people who were clever and those who were useful. Elena, he had only seen a woman drawing in charcoal on a napkin, was, in the ledger of his attention, an unspent token. He had not planned to touch a bar robbery that night. He did not move unless the friction in his world suggested it would be profitable or necessary. But Stan's place sat directly below a building he had recently acquired for reasons of future development, an old warehouse transformed into low-cost studios, a flirtation with philanthropy that doubled as an investment. When the call came, someone's eyes on a camera, a plea filed as a criminal motion in his area, the decision to intervene was a small one. He liked knowing how to be the answer. When he left, the city slid into its sleep in the way only Chicago could, lights scattering like ash across the lake. He thought of the card in her pocket and the wolf she drew, and he felt, absurdly, a line form between them. He liked lines. They were proof that things could be mapped and defended. Elena did not seek him out right away. She had a fear that some decisions looked like invitations and others like traps. But the world had grown small around her. Her bank accounts were a sequence of polite denials. Marcus's name moved like a lever in corridors she no longer occupied. He closed doors with the coolness of someone who never considered his own reflection. The emails threatened legal action if she attempted any unauthorized transfers. And a bank representative had told her, in the tone reserved for people who were not yet minefields, that her access was under review. She could paint, but the canvases did not pay rent. The wolf on the napkin spread from drawer to the wall in her flat. She drew him larger, charcoal thick as a confession, until the room smelled faintly of dust and smoke. The wolf's eyes were an echo of her own, watchful, teeth bared in a line that was almost a smile. Nikolai arrived at the studio without announcing himself the following week. The building had a bone-deep scent of solvent and dust. He walked past a corridor of canvases, and when he saw the wolf drawing, he stopped. He did not ask for permission to enter her space. He had never cared for permission where his interests lay. He preferred to observe the reaction and then make an offer. Elena did not look up at first. She had become skilled at pretending to be engrossed in something. Attention was a commodity she rationed. When she raised her head, she saw the suit like a machine made to hold people at the length of his decision. He did not smile. He did not need to. Instead, he put 2 documents on her work table, a deed and a check with a number that made her eyes sting. "You work here," he said, in a voice that was not a question. It was an accounting. "I have a studio," she corrected. "No, this used to be one of the studios on that floor." "It is a building now," he said. "I bought it." She laughed once, the sound its own small disbelief. You didn't have to. He watched her as if watching a storm form. Sometimes things work better when someone has the means to keep them. I want you to keep this studio. I don't want it prospering and leaving a void in my plans. He smiled then, faint and quick. And I am not sentimental, I'm acquisitive. Ownership took the form of an envelope. Inside, a check, a small clause in legal language that would transfer the studio into her name for as long as she wished to keep it. No strings, he said. But in the way he said it, the words were not wholly honest. There were always strings. He did not need to say them. The ones bound to his voice ran through the room like thread. I don't owe you anything, she said. It was both a statement and a shield. No, he agreed. You will owe me reality. She thought of Marcus's suits and the way he had called her temperamental in meetings, as if her sensitivity were a faux pas. She thought of lilies and phone screens. For the first time since the apartment, she felt a fissure open that was not filled with humiliation, but with a small, fierce appetite, to be paid in a manner that left the wolf on the napkin intact. Why? She asked. Not why he bought a building, she could guess. Why her? Why the studio? Why the wolf? He stepped closer and looked at the wolf as if reading a document. Because you draw what you'd rather not admit, he said. Because you don't sell out. Because you look at the thing you are afraid to be. That is rare in people I am asked to count. Her chest stilled. Compliment from a man like this was its own currency. But it was also a bartering token. She could see lines form in his face the way a map folded under pressure. He had an offer. Safety, money, a mortgage of his choosing, and it was an offer that smelled like vodka and old wood. She wanted to refuse, and also wanted, with something that felt like hunger masked as practicality, to accept. She was tired of choosing what looked like dignity when it tasted like foreclosure. She reached for the deed with hands that no longer trembled in the way they had the night of the robbery. She signed her name as if she were claiming a map. Keep your art, he said, low enough that the worker across the hall did not look in through his doorway. You will paint. They will want to buy. You will name what you are, and I will keep watch. Is this a job? She asked. Serious question. He watched her with an expression that stripped the conversation down to its utility. It is maintenance, he said. You will not be alone in this city if I can help it. She wanted the edge of his offer and feared its weight. There were reasons to be wary. Men like him carved the world into pieces and kept a ledger of what they thought belonged to them. He could give sanctuary and also claim it. She had been married once before, and that marriage had resembled a ledger. Now she stood across a different kind of accounting, one with shadows long enough to cross years. He left without asking for an answer that night, and she signed the deed 3 days later with a trembling that was steadier than grief. She slept badly the first week, with dreams of wolves pacing at the edge of a city that sometimes gnawed at strangers. When Marcus first heard the word sold, not sold perhaps, but acquired by a private investor, he raised an eyebrow as if Elena's life were a lawsuit he had not yet lost. He called, he texted, he sent lawyers who folded their words into a paper armor made of injunctions and late-night calls. He used their shared history as a kind of leverage, suggesting in thinly veiled ways that she owed him to maintain the image of the family, to not drag his name into the mud when mud was a social currency. Nikolai answered Marcus with a silence that was a long, deliberate thing. Where Marcus attempted to press, Nikolai expanded. He moved the threat further down the chessboard. A rumor planted, a quiet transfer of ownership sealed with the indifferent diplomacy of a man who had all the resources to place a bet and no affection for losing. Marcus pushed harder, trying to force an account freeze, to weave legal cords tight enough to bind even an advantaged buyer. That friction became a story in the gossip columns a month later. Art Harris flees marriage, new patron steps in. The narrative fit neatly if you did not look too close. Reporters liked simple arcs: betrayed wife, acquisitive benefactor, the ignominy of the rich fighting among themselves. They did not ask, and she did not answer, about nights when she could not sleep and painted until the charcoal smudged the edges of her fingers like a permanent declaration. The first time Nikolai kissed her, it was neither triumphant nor tender, but necessary. It happened in the studio after a week of adjustments, deliveries, a heating repair he had personally reprimanded a contractor over, a handshake with Stan that said, "We have a deal," in languages the newspapers could not parse. She had been painting a wolf in a flood of black and red. The red was not romantic so much as a corridor of anger and revision. He stood in the doorway watching how she navigated the paint, how her hands flinched and then found the line again. "You paint blood as if it's a map," he said. She wiped her hands on a rag and did not look at him. "Is that a problem?" "It is a fact," he corrected. "Maps are useful." "Is that how you see the world? Maps and use?" He took a step into the warm room and circled the easel like someone measuring the room for an eventual set of coordinates. When he reached out, his hand brushed the side of her wrist, too light to be a claim, but too deliberate to be an accident. Her skin remembered the era of softness she had allowed herself with Marcus and flinched. She turned then, because avoiding him had become its own kind of attention. They kissed because it answered a question neither had articulated. It was not violent, it was not performative. It was an agreement negotiated in a heartbeat that both acknowledged power and sought release from it. Afterwards, she felt raw and oddly alive, as if every nerve had been noted for inventory and then, surprisingly, left uncrated. She felt guilt like a currency she did not want to spend, and relief that was small and immediate. She had not been rescued in a way that erased her agency. She had chosen, with a tremor in her chest that counted as consent, for something she hoped would shelter her. But the shelter came with a cost. The city had a way of demanding everything in exchange for nothing. Marcus would not go quietly. He escalated his campaign to discredit, to make her the brittle center of a scandal. He hired private investigators who fed gossip columns and used legal maneuvers to threaten the transfer. A tabloid ran a photograph of her at a gallery peak, eyes downcast, wolf painting behind her, and printed a headline about a mysterious benefactor. Her friends texted, "Careful." Her mother, who still used a landline, cried and asked whether she had been safe. Elena answered with the truth and the half-truths she had become practiced at telling herself. Nikolai's response was a string of quiet moves. He put Yuri on surveillance of the Moretti's known hangouts, not because he believed the Moretti would move immediately against an artist, but because he liked to close squares on a board before danger learned how to shape itself. He paid for private security for the gallery opening and had men sweep the hotel that evening. When a car followed her home one night, just a dark sedan that blinked its lights twice, Yuri trailed it with a patience like granite. He did not allow himself the indulgence of being startled. He had seen the ways men believed they could frighten people into returning to arrangements that suited them. The public response hardened around her like a coat. Some people cheered. A woman leaving a dour marriage to pursue art was a neat myth. Others whispered that she had sold out for protection, feminism reframed into a different commerce. The press loved a clear villain, and Marcus obligingly wore the costume, angry, entitled, slathering his narrative with victimhood. He leaked that she had been unstable during their marriage, that her erratic behavior had cost partnerships. A magazine printed an interview with a former assistant who offered a single line of innuendo. Marcus tried to litigate reputation as if it were property and not a lineage of shared attention. The thing about truth and property was that sometimes the law supported the one and sometimes the other. Elena found herself speaking with a lawyer who used careful phrases like defamation and injunctive relief. He suggested options that sounded like maps again, cease and desists and quiet settlements. She had no interest in becoming a woman who sold her silence. She wanted, more than that, to be an artist who could move through her days without being cataloged by the tabloids. But she also knew that legal battles exhausted art. Nikolai watched the public trials unfold like a man watching the weather. He did not call the newspapers. He used influence the way some men used money, silently and without the need for applause. When Marcus escalated to threatening to take her to court over alleged breach of their prenuptial, Nikolai made a phone call that dissolved a benefactor's interest in a way the tabloids would never assign agency to. It was not the law so much as someone with enough standing to make events in the city awkward for certain men. Marcus sued anyway, more for fury than for testable claims. In the end, the case staggered into settlement with a hush that cost him more than he anticipated and made him cry about some lost image of control. Elena watched these moves with a complicated gratitude. He shielded her and gave back her studio and bought the building where the wolves lived. But he also rearranged the boundaries of her life. He offered a ring of safety, figurative at first, later tangible in forms those who watched would read as an engagement in different terms. They had dinners where he spoke of investments and maps. She painted and rebelled and painted again. There were nights that tasted like vanilla, nights that tasted like vodka, nights that tasted like lilies that had been bruised. When the rival families flexed, an attempt to pressure the building's tenants put arson threats and a staged assault at a neighboring gallery, Nikolai answered in ways that satisfied no one but themselves. Men with faces like flints arrived at dawn to replace locks. Yuri drove a van that smelled faintly of lemon and motor oil, and the restraint of someone who understood escalation. There were fights, some of them ugly, that required swift hands and careful discretion. The city hummed its warnings, and Elena painted them in red and black because she needed the color to be honest. After a late confrontation where a Moretti lieutenant made the mistake of thinking threats could be delivered to an artist, a clean pistol barked in the dark and a body went silent on a rain-slicked alley. No gore, only the clatter and the wetness of things ending. The Moretti sent a note, thin paper, 2 words. Nikolai replied with 3, a photograph, a deed, a name. He did not enjoy killing, he called it maintenance. Elena, who had watched him in those moments with the pry-bar attention of someone cataloging wolves, felt both sick and protected. The sensation of being protected by someone's willingness to remove danger was a kind of violence that settled in her like a living history. She tried to reconcile gratitude with revulsion and found herself failing beautifully at both. Sleep became a place where she saw wolves and lilies in the same dream, where she woke with charcoal under her fingernails and perfume that was neither virgin nor villainous on her pillow. She had trade-offs to consider, her art, her safety, her autonomy. Each night the ledger changed in her head. Sometimes she imagined packing another bag and going back to her parents' house for a while. Sometimes she imagined accepting everything Nikolai offered and learning to live as a woman who would not be questioned in the tabloid narrative. Both ideas tasted of something like surrender, and both tasted like survival. Her paintings began selling, not just to narrow circles of the city's decorative wealthy, but to collectors who liked the rawness of her wolves and the red strokes that suggested a detail of life not often shown, the cost of claiming oneself in a city that preferred neat narratives. The sales were small but steady. Galleries wrote notes in their cloth-quiet tones, and a review in a reputable magazine called her work feral and deliberate. A photograph of her at a private viewing ran with a caption that called the wolf motif a new signature. People liked signatures, they were easy to market. At the gallery, Mosquito, an art critic with a taste for brutal honesty under the guise of insight, said, as he sipped something that tasted like contempt, "Your wolves look like you might bite the very hand that feeds you." She looked at him without flinching. "Then I'm feeding carefully." Someone in the back laughed. It was not an antagonistic laugh, but one that tasted like recognition. She stood there in a dress that was not red but had the shadow of that color in it, And she realized with a small, steady astonishment that she had rebuilt herself around edges she had not known were hers. The wolves on her canvases were scraps of the very map she was beginning to chart. Outside, a valet snapped a photograph of a man in a charcoal suit leaving the building. He did not look like a villain in the way magazines liked villains to look. Villains were supposed to be gaudy, to make tonal mistakes. He was precise and cold and smelled faintly of vodka. He had a way of placing his palm on the small of her back when they moved through a crowd, an ownership asserted like punctuation, and she felt the press of it as both pressure and warmth. By the time spring pressed itself along the lakefront, the city had learned her name. Some called her a trophy. Some called her an enigma. Some saw only the romance and not the ledger. Marcus faded into lawsuits and spiteful op-eds and, eventually, a bankruptcy that the press treated like an arithmetic curiosity, a man who miscalculated. She sat one evening in the studio and drew the wolf again, the charcoal sweeping into the long ritual stroke she had developed that evening in Stan's bar. He was not a pet or a monster. He was a vector. She shaded the eyes darker and thought of everything that had happened between the lilies and this charcoal. Nikolai came in later, carrying a bottle of vodka with a label she had only seen in rooms where men made decisions at the scale of neighborhoods. "You paint better when you have something to be angry at," he said. "I paint because I was left," she replied. "You were not left," he said. His voice folded the room. "You were found." She hesitated. The truth was complicated. The language of rescue made a tidy story. Ownership could be named protection, and protection could be named claim. She did not yet know what to call the fact that she had traded one insecure marriage for a different ledger, one that paid in safety and in danger in equal parts. "Do you ever regret buying a building?" she asked. "Only when it is bare," he said. "I prefer things with people in them. It makes them worth guarding." She looked at him then, and for the first time thought of a future that might include a contracted fall from grace and the slow honey of power. Power, she realized, was a taste. It could be drunk neat at a small table or disguised in a bottle that said nothing. She had taken that first sip without truly knowing the drink. Outside, the lake was a sheet of black that swallowed the city lights. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm barked and stopped as if a signal had been given. The wolves in her paintings watched the room like sentries. The lilies in the memory were browned at the petal edges. She touched the charcoal and found her fingerprints smudged across the wolf's jaw. It was a signature and a scar. Nikolai set the bottle on the table and watched the smear her hand had made. "You sign your work in a place people can never find," he observed. "It is not a place for them," she said. "It is for me." He nodded, as if that answered the question. Outside, the city breathed unevenly. Justice, in the city's terms, was sometimes a negotiation with noise. Newspapers, lawyers, the limp theatrics of men who thought they could own the narrative. She had chosen a man who understood narrative as a set of correctives. They did not, yet, promise each other anything that mattered in the language of vows. The word marriage had been used as a weapon in her life, and she was not ready to let it be wielded again without seeing the blade. But there was a thread between them, unlikely and thin as linen, that ran through the studio and out into the street. Safety paid in the currency of exchange. Tenderness that had not yet been catalogued. Danger that could be counted in the things removed for the sake of protection. Some nights she felt like a woman who had moved from one cage into another and called it freedom. Other nights she felt like an artist whose hand had finally been allowed to keep a place to make a mark. The ledger changed daily. The wolf watched and waited, and she painted. When the first true test arrived, it would come at a gala under crystal and flashbulbs, an event that would demand a public claim and also invite a spectacle. It would bring Marcus back in another costume and bring rivals to bare their teeth in public. But that night had not yet come. For now, there was charcoal and vodka and the sound of the city's heartbeat through the walls. Inside the studio, with the wolf's eyes drawn darker than the night, Elena leaned back and let the charcoal smear into a horizon she could not erase. Outside, in a car that kept its engine alive like a guardian, Yuri watched the streetlight and made a note. Somewhere, in an office of glass, men checked boxes that made small disasters into solvable problems. The city breathed, and the wolves learned the map. Elena did not know, that night, how much she would keep and how much she would lose. She only knew that she had been brave enough to leave the lilies on the nightstand and brave enough to pick up a charcoal and name herself again. Morning found the studio in the slow, patient light of a city that claimed dawn as a courtesy. Dust turned gold in the beams that cut through the high windows. Elena moved through that light like someone learning the contours of a body she had not yet recognized. She stepped around canvases, turned the wolf's face a few degrees, and watched how the charcoal caught and swallowed the new orientation of light. Nikolai had left instructions on the table, crisp with the kind of certainty that could be ordered like meal courses. Layouts, names, addresses, a list of who would enter through which door. His handwriting was spare, economical. There was a single scrawl at the bottom that read, in a way he seldom spoke aloud, "Bring her out when she is ready." She worked in silence until Yuri came in, removing his cap like a man taking off a small private weight. He set a sheet of photographs beside the bottle of vodka, angles of the gallery where the gala would be, a map of the servitors' entrances, a list of plates. He had marked 2 cars with red circles and written, in a steady hand, 2 names beneath them. He did not need to say why they were circled. Morning, he said, as if morning itself required permission to arrive. She did not answer immediately. She stretched a smear of charcoal along the wolf's cheek and found the weakness of the edge. "Do you think they'll notice a smear?" she asked, finally. Yuri looked at the wolf as if he were assessing a patrol route. "They will notice what you let them notice," he said. "They will not see the seam." They spoke of small things because they were the things they could bear to speak aloud. Brush sizes, frame finishes, the angle of a light that would make a portrait read as breathing in a room full of air. The larger conversations were kept for the hours before sleep, when Nikolai's voice folded the night and put claims into the air like unspoken oaths. They made their plans like people arranging bandages, careful, tidy, designed to hold a body together if pressure came. On the second afternoon before the gala, a courier arrived with a package tied in twine. Elena opened it with fingers that trembled only a little and found a dress folded like a confession. It was simple and dangerous at once. Black, with a throat that sat high enough to be modest, a back that fell away like the city itself, pulling back its layers. There was a note pinned to the fabric, in handwriting that was not Nikolai's. The note read, "Wear it when you decide to be seen." She carried the dress to the window and held it against the light. For a moment, the studio became a theater of choices. The lilies she had left remained on the nightstand in the room they had given her, a half-remembered nicety of an old life. She thought of Marcus then, the shape of his promises turned public, as if he had been saving all his declarations for an audience that rewarded the loudest claim. In her memory, he wore civility like a coat he could shrug off when it suited him. She imagined him in some costume of respectability, wandering through the room where men collected applause. Nikolai found her with the dress at her shoulders. He did not touch the fabric. Instead, he placed a hand on the wolf's canvas, where her signature had been smudged into the jaw like a hidden scar. "If they ask who stands behind you," he said, "we will say you stood alone until you chose otherwise." "You will say whatever keeps us both intact," she replied. She thought she heard in his sentence both consolation and a ledger being balanced. He smiled, just briefly, the way men did when they counted their advantages. There were calls to be returned, dinners to be refused, favors to distribute. The city's small mercies came wrapped in necessity. A columnist to placate, a philanthropist to seat near the stage, a rival to mollify with a promise of future cooperation. These were the measures of public life, the polite rounding of sharp corners. Elena answered only some of them herself. Nikolai handled the rest, his voice economical, his gestures like the turning of pages. Yuri watched, and the car with its engine always on waited at the curb. On the evening before the gala, Elena painted late. The studio had the smell of turpentine and vodka and something human that refused to be put in a jar. She worked until the charcoal made a horizon she could not erase, until the wolf's eyes were as deep as the lake outside. When she finally stepped back, late, she noticed a small alteration in the painting that she had not made. A faint, almost imperceptible line at the wolf's throat, an incision of ink as neat as a letter. She ran her fingers over it and felt the grit of fingerprints that were not hers. Someone had touched the place she kept hidden. She did not tell Nikolai. There are truths kept like seeds. You bury them because you do not yet know what will grow. Instead, she wrapped the painting and set it where the morning light could not reach. She went home and slept with the dress on the chair beside the bed like a promise she had not yet learned to accept. Gala night arrived with the city in a flurry of glass and steel. The air smelled of rain on concrete. The venue had been chosen for its neutral light and its capacity to be shaped. A choir of chandeliers would drown 1,000 small indiscretions under their crystal. Men arrived who measured power by the width of their shoulders. Women came with their own armor pressed around their ribs, smiles that cut, shoes that claimed roads. Elena moved through the space like someone who had been told she must step onto ice and yet had to make it look effortless. Her dress came on like a second skin. Her hair, when it was arranged, was a statement of practiced nonchalance. She had not smiled much in the days before the gala. Smiles were for photographs. They were not always for the mirror. Nikolai's people had arranged a private entrance. Elena did not see their faces. She saw only their movements, a choreography designed to keep her invisible until the moment the room would be forced to notice. Yuri stood close, his eyes scanning and cataloging. He handed her a champagne flute as if handing a weapon. "You know who will come," he said. "I know who might," she corrected. There was a man at the door with the slow, patient brutality of someone accustomed to being allowed to speak last. Marcus did not enter the room at first. He lingered in the doorway as if measuring the air, his costume of civility more carefully tailored than the crowd's expectations. The guests did not yet know the exact tenor of his arrival. They could only feel it as a shift, the kind that makes the temperature in a room fall by degrees. Elena felt his presence like a pressure against the skin. She had not expected to care, and yet she felt the old pattern rearrange itself, as if muscles remembered how to run. Marcus's eyes found her across the room like a hand finding an old scar. He moved through the crowd the way a rumor moves through a quiet town, soft sounds building into waves. He did not push. He allowed the room to part for him because it did. Outside, the city had closed its shutters. Inside, conversations fell into the background like surf. Marcus approached with a smile calibrated to suggestion. He spoke to her first without taking hands, without the intimacy she remembered from rooms where promises had been traded like private currencies. "Elena," he said. The name from his mouth had the texture of the past, but carried a new tone. Public, softer, as if forgiveness had been rehearsed. She did not answer him with the old warmth. She had learned to keep her guard like glass, translucent enough to let light through, sharp enough to cut if misused. "You look well," he said. "I heard about the wolf." "It is not a thing to be heard about," she replied. "It is a thing to be seen." He inclined his head like a man acknowledging a riddle.
Around them, there were flashbulbs and a polite rustling of program notes. Marcus glided away, and people turned, as he knew they would, to see who lingered in his orbit. He had become, in the city's language, a performer of calm.
He had learned the art of appearing as if nothing needed to be proved. The crowd rewarded him. Nikolai watched the exchange from a corner where light pooled like a secret. He did not smile. The ledger in his eyes was precise. Elena felt the old ledger shift beneath her feet. Obligations inked and due, favors to be called in like debts. She had entered his life with a currency that required payment in ways that were not always cash. Silence, presence, alignment. She had agreed to the rules because in his shelter there was a clarity she had not had in the house with lilies. But clarity had costs. When the program began, Elena felt the room's attention gather around her like a net. She had agreed to speak for a moment, 2 minutes they had requested, about the piece. Nikolai had not insisted she refused. He had merely noted that it would be useful. Public claim. The word sat on her tongue like a bitter herb. She had long ago learned that names were not just labels, they were deeds assigned in public. Unnamed acts could be called accidental, named acts became obligations. She stood as her name was called. The wolf's canvas waited at the far end of the room, lit like an altar. Photographers leaned forward with their lenses like supplicants. Elena moved as if through fog. The applause that greeted her was the warm, habitual sound of a machine lubricated with expectations. She walked to the painting, felt the light lay itself across the wolf's painted eyes, and saw then, in the reflection of the varnish, 100 faces rearranged into a mirror of who could be bought and who could not. She had rehearsed what she would say, a few sentences about form, about the necessity of hiding and the audacity of being found. Now that she stood before them, words came as if they had been waiting in a room behind other rooms, reluctant to appear. "I make things to see what stays," she said, hearing her voice as if through a slit. "I make things to be accountable to myself." There was a ripple of polite approval. Marcus watched from the wings as if he were a director pleased by a scene unfolding. Nikolai's hands were folded, Yuri's face remained unreadable. Somewhere in the crowd, a rival smiled in a way that promised future troubles. Then, just as she prepared to step back and let the murmurs take her, a man, one she had not expected to be at the gala, stood. He had the posture of someone who had rehearsed outrage. He called her name, then said something short into a microphone that had, until that moment, been in play. The content of his interruption was not important. Interruptions had a way of bringing the city's private weather into public rooms. What mattered was the change. The hall's atmosphere condensed into a single electric motion. Lights flickered. For a beat, everyone looked at the ceiling as if the room might split open. Then, the chandelier nearest the wolf dimmed, a small and deliberate shadow passing across the beast's face. She had rehearsed what she would say, a few sentences about form, about the necessity of hiding and the audacity of being found. Now that she stood before them, words came as if they had been waiting in a room behind other rooms, reluctant to appear. "I make things to see what stays," she said, hearing her voice as if through a slit. "I make things to be accountable to myself." There was a ripple of polite approval. Marcus watched from the wings as if he were a director pleased by a scene unfolding. Nikolai's hands were folded, Yuri's face remained unreadable. Somewhere in the crowd, a rival smiled in a way that promised future troubles. Then, just as she prepared to step back and let the murmurs take her, a man, one she had not expected to be at the gala, stood. He had the posture of someone who had rehearsed outrage. He called her name, then said something short into a microphone that had, until that moment, been in play. The content of his interruption was not important. Interruptions had a way of bringing the city's private weather into public rooms. What mattered was the change. The hall's atmosphere condensed into a single electric motion.
Lights flickered. For a beat, everyone looked at the ceiling as if the room might split open. Then the chandelier nearest the wolf dimmed, a small and deliberate shadow passing across the beast's face.
Flashbulbs tried to compensate, and the camera sensors reacted with a merciless glare. Elena felt the change like a hand on the back of her neck. Her breath caught. This was no accidental malfunction. This was choreography by a hand that knew how to make audiences lean forward. She felt Nikolai's presence tighten beside her, like a wire pulled taut. Yuri's fingers closed around the small of her wrist, and his mouth moved, shaping words she could not hear. Somewhere in the crowd, Marcus smiled with a new calculation. The rival who had risen sat back down, as if satisfied. Another man at the edge of the room shifted his feet and met her eyes. There were arrangements being whispered into phones. A waiter dropped a tray with a sound that was too loud, and then, in the space of that noise, the microphone picked up the edge of a voice, someone else's voice, speaking a name. It was not yet clear who would win the room. Elena knew only that she had been put on a stage without consent, and that the wolves in her paintings were watching this new theater with the patient hunger of predators that had learned there were different kinds of prey. She felt the charcoal bite into her palm where she had unconsciously clenched it. The signature she had hidden was there, under the varnish of practice and speech. She stepped forward because movement felt safer than paralysis. The wolf's eyes seemed to look back, as if to say, "Decide." And then, at the exact edge of that decision, the lights went out. The chandelier, obedient until this moment, surrendered the room to darkness like a held breath finally released. In the sudden black, the flashbulbs popped like distant fireworks, a dozen white flowers exploding against the dark. Someone laughed, high and brittle. Someone else swore. In that thin, suspended absence of light, Elena felt a hold on her arm tighten. Not hers, not Nikolai's, but the grip of a man she had thought would never touch her again. He spoke her name into the dark, quietly enough that only she could hear it, and the word landed like a stone. Elena. She knew the voice without being told. The room was a throat of silence around them, and in the dark, people's breaths became small, private lanterns. Her next movement would be witnessed. She could feel the audience congeal into expectation. She could choose to step back into the room and let others decide the frame, or she could step forward and cut the lens herself. The wolf's jaw waited in painted quiet. The charcoal grit under her nails felt suddenly like a tool rather than a mark. She inhaled, and in the dark, her lungs filled with the city's cold air and the memory of lilies. Then she moved.